Hello, everyone. How are you today? My name is Ruben Oropesa, and I'm very happy to see you again in today's Grammar Capsule. It's a very important capsule that we are going to check because we're going to analyze in detail simple present structures, a very useful grammar structure to communicate in English. So before we start, let's check the idea behind the simple present. As it says here, we use the simple present to talk about our daily routines. For example, I work every day. Maybe my habits, like, I take a shower in the mornings. Preferences, like for me, I like pizza. And activities you do on a daily basis. For example, I finish work at 9, I watch TV after work. And it's a very important structure because it's one of the most commonly used structures in the language. So why don't we take this time to analyze the idea behind the simple present? As you can see here, the structure is very easy. To create a sentence, you start with your subject, and then after the subject is your activity. The activity is basically the verb and the complement. For example, I can say that that's my subject, work, that is my verb, every day. I work every day. Or you, that's your subject, study English. Study is the verb, and English would be the complement. Or, for example, they play video games. They is your subject, play is the verb, and games would be the complement. So, one of the most important ideas behind the simple present is, of course, verbs. But before we check some verbs, let's take a closer look at this very important grammar. When you create a sentence in English, you have in simple present, you have your grammar structure, and the grammar structure is as follows. You always start with your subject. For example, I check my email every morning. However, if you want to use a negative idea, the auxiliary is don't. For example, I don't check my email on weekends. And as you can see in this presentation, you have in here the subjects. I, you, we, and they. So you can follow this structure using any of the subjects, but I don't know if you have noticed what subjects are not here. Exactly, he, she, and it. It's because in simple present, he, she, and it have a special conjugation that we are going to check in a couple more slides. However, this is the structure to create sentences in affirmative or negative with the subjects I, you, we, and they. And as mentioned before, one of the most important parts behind these sentences in simple present is, of course, the verbs. So in here you have some common routines. For example, how do you say in English, trabajar? Exactly, work, as the first picture says. Which of these verbs means manejar? Exactly, drive. Estudiar? Study. How about limpiar? Clean. Dormir? Sleep. And cocinar? Cook. So before we continue, let's check the pronunciation of these commonly used verbs to talk about routines. Ready? Repeat after me. Work, drive, study, clean, sleep, cook. And as you can see here, you have another example. I clean my house on Sundays. What would be the negative sentence? Of course, I don't clean my house on Sundays. So remember what we said about third person verbs? Well, in third person, he, she, and it, we have a special conjugation to the verb. Let's check some examples. For example, in here I have a sentence, and the sentence says, Laura runs in the mornings. If you notice, the conjugation for third person is very simple. You only add an S to the verb. For example, run, I run, but Laura runs. Simple as that. Let's take a look at another example. For example, I eat healthy, but Luis eats healthy. If you notice, you add the S to the verb because you're talking in third person singular. How about this one? The dog plays. So it's a very easy structure. You just have to remember that for he, she, and it in affirmative sentences, you add S to the verb. Work, works. Cook, cooks. Check, checks. Pretty easy, right? Of course. But as in many presentations, there are always some exceptions. So let's check some exceptions for third person conjugations. If you check this idea, it might look very similar to something you have already seen. Of course, remember that rule we saw of singular to plural words, singular to plural nouns? Well, in third person verbs, we follow that same rule. When the verb ends in S, double S, SH, CH, X, Z, or O, you add an ES to third person affirmative verbs. For example, she watches TV. I add ES because the verb watch ends in CH. Or another example, she goes to the movies on Saturdays. If you check the verb go, it ends in O, so I add ES. And she brushes her teeth every morning. I add ES to the verb brush because it ends in SH. So just remember that every time that a verb ends in S, double S, SH, CH, X, Z, or O, you add an ES at the end for affirmative verbs for third person. Don't worry, we don't have so many. There are not many verbs. It's more common to have the verb S as the one here. But when you see these verbs, just have to make that little change to the ES. And the other exception is when the verb ends in consonant plus Y, you replace the Y for I and then add ES. Examples, he studies English, he flies a plane, or he cries. Not many verbs, but yes, very, very, very similar, actually the same as singular to plural nouns like dictionary, dictionaries, fly, flies. It's the same idea. So you can start seeing that there are many rules in English that are very repetitive. In this case, the singular to plural rule applies to third person conjugations in affirmative sentences. And there is one more exception with the verb have. The verb have in third person affirmative is has. It's considered irregular because it doesn't follow a rule, or I mean there are not other verbs with the same rule. So in this case, if you want to mention about someone using the verb have, you can say, as the example here, he has a project today, she has meetings every morning. You don't say haves, you don't say haves. Yes, it's HAS in affirmative sentences. Now, this is important. I keep saying affirmative sentences because in negative, what we change is the auxiliary. Let's take a look at the auxiliary in negative for third person singular. In negative, what you modify is don't to doesn't, and the verb stays in simple form. So all the rules we saw and the exceptions for third person singular don't apply to negative structures, because in negative structures, what you modify is the auxiliary don't to doesn't. An example you have here: he doesn't work on Sundays. She doesn't take French. Notice how I don't have an S to the verb work, because that ES idea, we moved it to the don't, doesn't. Great job. And in here you have an example of affirmative sentences of how you conjugate verbs in English. So if you notice, I work every day, it's the same structure. You work every day, we work every day, they work every day. So we only make one change for he, she, and it by adding the S to the verb. So technically there's only one conjugation for he, she, and it. For example, he works every day, she works every day, or if I'm talking about a TV, it works. And of course, those exceptions. But if you think about it, conjugating verbs in simple present is not that complicated, right? And the negative, you have the don't, and the doesn't is only for he, she, and it. For example, I don't work on Sundays, you don't work, we don't work, they don't work. But for he, she, and it, he doesn't work, she doesn't work, and it doesn't work. And yes, the pronunciation is doesn't. So hopefully this presentation is going to help you start using verbs in English to talk about what you do on a daily basis. What is your routine? Well, that's it from my side. Thanks for watching. My name is Ruben Oropesa, and remember to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and our YouTube channel to check more grammar capsules. Have a wonderful day and see you next time.